Good morning. There's a story of a church who were advertising for a new pastor. The church received plenty of applicants who emailed in their CVs, and the search team narrowed their choices down to 4 candidates. One candidate seemed to shine above all the others. He had an excellent reputation. He had a top theological degree from a very good and well-known college. He had considerable life experience in the business world before working in a church. And so most of the search team were thinking, this is our guy. But one older member of the team looked at the candidate's CV and said, this man lacks something. He lacks something so fundamental we should not even think about interviewing him. Well, what was it he lacked, which the other members of the search team missed? The applicant lacked suffering. His CV contained no evidence of suffering in his life. He had not experienced any trials or turmoil in his life. And the point the older and wiser member of the search team made was this: suffering is part and parcel of human experience and life. And if you're going to pass to other people, you need to be able to pass it out of your experience. If you cannot demonstrate personal trials in your life, you probably won't be effective as a pastor. Well, this candidate didn't make it to the interview round. Now, whether he should have been interviewed or not really is by the by. I tell you the story to make a point. And the point is this, that suffering and trials are part of the human experience. To pretend otherwise is to deny the evidence of life before us. And yet I found some people think it's their natural right to live in a world where they escape any form of suffering. When you bring faith into the issue, some people think that God's job is to create a world where they escape all forms of suffering, and God should simply fulfill their material and their personal and their emotional needs. Some people think they have an inherent right to avoid trials and suffering of any kind. One of the remarkable things about the Christian faith, when it's taught correctly, is that the Bible accurately reflects human experience when it comes to trials and suffering. Tim Keller says, it should be that hard work will always lead to prosperity, but sometimes hard work is wiped away by injustice or disaster. The good pattern of the world created by God is that working hard should produce fruitful results to live by and live off. But Keller reminds us that the teaching of the fall in Genesis chapter 3 shows that sometimes hard work only produces thorns and thistles. And many people will readily testify to this reality. Hard work does not always equal prosperity. The brokenness of this world is there for all of us to see and sadly experience in some form or another. The Bible teaches that both natural suffering exists and the human race suffers because we reap what we sow. So if we're up a tree with a chainsaw and we don't take the proper safety equipment with us and fall and cut our arm off, we reap the careless results of the actions that we've taken. What about COVID-19? Is that the result of cross-species contamination in the Chinese market? Was someone careless and the whole world suffers as a result? We reap what we sow? Or is COVID-19 a natural disaster which occurs in a broken world and has spread rapidly around the world, like the plague or the swine flu? The Bible teaches that both sorts of suffering exist, and the associated trials that follow are a consequence and part of human reality and experience. The question before us this morning is, how do we react to trials? How do we react to any suffering and the subsequent trials which come upon us? I'm going to tell you a story. When we learned that my wife Maureen had a terminal cancer diagnosis, we gradually shared it with our family, our friends, and our church community. Several months later, during an open sharing time in our Sunday church service, a lady got up and announced that her husband, who was sat next to her, had got liver cancer and the prognosis looked bad. After a long story about going to the doctors and getting tests and getting a definitive result, the lady said something which really shocked me. She said, "I thank God for giving my husband cancer because so many good things have come out of it." And she said this with a smiling face and an upbeat tone of voice. And frankly, sitting there, I couldn't have felt more opposite to what she was saying. And I wished there and then that she would shut up and sit down. I was not thankful for the trial of cancer that Maureen and I were going through, and I was not happy and joyful for what we were experiencing. And to this day, I do not know whether this lady was thanking God, whether she was genuine, or whether she was just putting on a show to avoid breaking down in public. But her words remind me of verse 2 in James' letter. Today's Bible reading, first letter of James, chapter 1, verses 1 to 12. And verse 2 reads like this: Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. Consider it pure joy. I readily admit to you, I did not consider it pure joy that Maureen had terminal cancer. And then she went on to die 3 years later. The trial of seeing your loved one slowly die is not pure joy by any means. I suspect that whatever trials you are currently facing, or when you have faced trials, the phrase pure joy has seldom come to mind. Pure joy is usually reserved in human terms for your wedding day, the birth of a child, buying a new home, getting a new job, Chelsea winning the Champions League, but not an experience when undergoing trials. What sort of trials were the Christians facing to whom James were writing? Well, probably trials for their faith. Because they were Christians, they faced social exclusion. They faced economic boycott, loss of income, and that led to poverty. But these aren't the only trials we face in life. James says trials of many kinds. And many kinds include sickness, persecution, loneliness, bereavement, amongst others. So what trials are you facing today, this week, in Harpenden, in lockdown, due to coronavirus? I might guess that persecution for your faith is unlikely. But I would think if you live alone, loneliness may be a current trial. If you live with your family and you've been cooped up together for 10 weeks, then your trial might be the mounting frustration at the lack of personal space. If you enjoy meeting people, then social confinement is a trial. If you are sick, then concern for your health is a trial. And if you are vulnerable, then fear of catching COVID-19 will be a trial. This lockdown and this worldwide pandemic has brought trials and challenges which we would never have expected or encountered before. And James says we're to consider these pure joy. How does that equate? To understand what James is on about, you have to go beyond a human understanding of life and take on a heavenly perspective. Just reading these words with human eyes will not make sense. But reading these words with a spiritual perspective will make sense. Christians can respond to trials with joy because we know that God uses trials to perfect our faith and make us stronger believers. Douglas Moo is a New Testament scholar. He says that the difficulties of life are intended by God to refine our faith, heating it in the crucible of suffering so that impurities might be refined away and your faith might become pure and valuable to God. This testing of faith is not intended to determine whether you have faith or not. It's intended to purify and deepen the faith that you already have. And part of this purification, in this testing of your faith, the virtue of perseverance is developed. Often when you first come to faith in Jesus, there's a deep flush of excitement and joy, and that's wonderful, but that's just the start. Newfound faith is not the end goal. The end goal is to be transformed into the image of Christ, to become like Jesus in attitudes, in thoughts, in spirit, in action. Faith needs to be developed, and part of that development is perseverance. Like a muscle, it becomes strong when it faces resistance. So Christian faith is strengthened when we face difficulty and trials. Jesus learned this. Abraham learned this. David and many other biblical figures learned this. And so it is why James can say, consider it joy when you face trials of all sorts. Because James is looking at the spiritual, the eternal perspective of life. James knows that out of trials comes perseverance, and out of perseverance comes maturity, and then completeness. So it is in a way like a chain reaction. Trials lead to perseverance. Perseverance leads to maturity. Maturity leads to completeness. And the intended result of perseverance then is completeness. James doesn't define completeness, but I suggest it is nothing less than being conformed to the image of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. When you think, speak, and act like Jesus, then his Spirit is fully alive in you, and this is the goal for all believers in Jesus. But the goal to this, getting to this goal, involves a journey, and part of that journey involves removing the dross and the rubbish out of our own lives. It is the Father who uses trials of various sorts to do this, to achieve this purpose. And I will honestly say to you, from the physical, emotional, human-only perspective, trials are hard. But it is why James wrote this letter, and Paul wrote the same thing in the church to Rome, and Peter wrote the same thing in his first letter. This is a teaching and a wisdom which equips every Christian to understand and to help us pass through the difficult periods when trials enter our lives. Let's move on to verse 5. James writes, "If any of you lack wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you." Wisdom is not common sense. Common sense is not walking in front of a car on the road. Common sense is not running with scissors. Wisdom is knowing that keeping bad company will lead me astray. Wisdom is not following a fool into his pit. Wisdom is knowing what is right and keeping to it. Wisdom is how do I react when trials come upon me and my family. After Maureen died, I went through a trial of loss and grief. I worked, I slept, I went fishing, I explored. I had friends and family support me. I tried a few support groups, one worked, one didn't. I don't really remember much more. It was a case of I knew I would get through it, but I wasn't sure exactly when. Simply, it was a life of plodding, one day after another, and repeat, knowing eventually it would end. But also realizing that coming out of my trial of grief, life would not be the same as when I went into it. My faith in the loving nature of God as a good God kept me going. That God allows suffering but isn't the author of it. That God is sovereign but not responsible for my suffering. And that God knows intimately what suffering is. The Father saw the Son die on the cross. And the Son took upon himself the sin of the world and died for me. Why didn't God step in and heal Maureen? I don't know. And I probably won't know this side of heaven, but that's okay. To trust God when we do not understand him is to treat him as God, not as another human being. To trust God when we do not understand him is to treat him as God, not as another human being. That was said by Elizabeth Elliot. In this trust, we glorify God, and we find our rest in him, not in any human or not in the circumstances we find ourselves in. This is the wisdom and the character which perseverance and endurance produces. This is the wisdom of perseverance which God supplies to those who ask. Moving on, what about verses 6 to 8? But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do. Who is the doubting person in these verses? Well, let me tell you, the doubting person is not someone who struggles with their faith. The doubting person is someone who is double-minded. It is someone who is not fully committed to God. It is someone whose main interest is themselves and their own enjoyment of this world, but they hedge their bets, playing safe and praying to God in case he really does exist. This way they think they can get the best of both worlds, if there is a hereafter. James warns that such a person will not get wisdom. In fact, they will not receive anything from God at all. The Old Testament scholar Gerhard von Rad wrote this. He said, "Wisdom is to be competent in regards to the realities of life." Wisdom is to be competent in regards to the realities of life. And one of the realities of life is that trials of various kinds will come our way. How do we get this wisdom to handle these trials? Sometimes God gives us wisdom as we go through the trial. The whole process is a development in perseverance and a growing wisdom of understanding what is going on. Sometimes God imparts wisdom, a new understanding and revelation directly from God to us by His Holy Spirit. And thirdly, God has left us with wisdom which we find as we read in His Word in the Bible. The Bible has much to say about trials and suffering. It's there if we but take some time to pick it up and read about it. The greatest teaching in the Bible on trials is that the Bible teaches me that suffering is not meaningless. The Bible teaches me about a God who knew trials and suffering firsthand. The Bible teaches me that the Son of God left heaven, took on human flesh, and suffered death on a cross at the hands of men. Why did He do this? Because He loves you and He loves me. The evil, the wrongdoing, the sin in this world deserves the judgment of God. And every single person is guilty of committing some sin and causing suffering to others. This separates us from God. It should result in God's judgment upon us. But God sent His Son to take our place, to carry our sin, to receive our judgment on the cross as our substitute. So through the suffering of Jesus Christ, the whole world is blessed. Jesus defeated sin, He defeated death, He defeated evil and suffering on the cross, and in the fullness of time, all suffering, all trials will be done away with. Do we wish to participate in this suffering of Jesus and believe in it for ourselves? So the Father and Son achieved all this through suffering, not in spite of it. Tim Keller writes, "It is through the suffering of God that the suffering of mankind will eventually be overcome and undone." The suffering of God is at the heart of the Christian faith. Perhaps it shouldn't be a surprise then when trials of various kinds come to the Christian. It may be hard to respond with joy as you walk through this trial. But know that each trial builds perseverance, and perseverance leads to maturity, and maturity leads to completeness in the person of Jesus. This is what you have been called to. Amen. Well, God be with you, and God bless you this week.